Welcome everyone to today's webinar from the Open Group. You're all very welcome. Look at the registration. I know we've got people from all around the globe, so as I said, you're all very welcome. Today's speaker, Craig Martin of Enterprise Architects, to keep the event moving forward smoothly for everyone. We will handle all the questions at the end of the presentation. So Craig, if you're ready, can I ask you to start your presentation?
Yes, and thanks, Simon. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. We really have quite a diverse audience online. And just want to thank you for giving me the time just to share some of our insights into the business analysis and business architecture space. And really, let's get started. So just to take you through a short agenda for what I'm going to try and cover today. There is quite a bit of content, but I think we have enough time to get through it all. And so really just looking at giving you a little bit of contextualization to start with. So that's just giving you some background as to some of the shifts that we're seeing occurring, slightly more conceptual, and then sort of go into the deeper dive into the business architecture and analysis space around the skills and paths. I'm going to talk you through some opportunities and how we can look to bridge the divide, not necessarily just between business analysis and business architecture, but also towards the business. We'll then also be looking through a couple of tools to support the business disciplines, and I'll be taking some detail down on the business views and models, as well as looking at a method of execution. And then I'll just finish off very lightly with a sort of a team look and feel that we've seen to be quite successful. So just a brief overview, just a one-slider from our side for Enterprise Architects. We're an international provider of architecture services, so we are a niche player in this area, and really sort of focus on sort of four pillars of the business. One which addresses corporate customers, which are referred to as enterprise clients, and one which addresses the actual architect, in other words, the whole life cycle and journey of an individual as they travel the journey of an architect. We also have a number of courses that we offer, and also support a number of communities and thought leadership events that we host at our offices around the globe. And really that's just a short summary of who we are. This is also a precursor to the Open Group conference, which is being held in Australia. It's the first time the Open Group have held this conference in Australia. And a lot of the concepts that I'm introducing here, I'm going to then be expanding on in a lot more detail during a plenary session at that conference. And I understand that may be recorded as well. And that's really to do with, okay, well, how do we take some of the principles that I'm going to refer to here and actually string it together to create what we refer to as a cohesive business. So if you're available, join us at the Sydney conference from April 15th. Right, so just to set some background and contextualize, I often refer to this fairly simple little framework slide to give people a view of and introduce the concept of what we refer to as building blocks. And really, I'm going to refer to this slide and these concepts consistently throughout the presentation. And it really talks about, well, what is business about? It's really about building advantages, prolonging advantages, and reducing some disadvantages. And in order to do that and create my differentiation in the market, I need to come up with innovative ways to assemble, mix, and innovate the assets within my business. And those assets are what we often refer to as utilities. So you're going to hear me mention this word utility quite often during these presentations. And sometimes we refer to that as the foundation layer. And just to contextualize a little further, Roger Martin wrote an interesting book on the design of business, which spoke about tackling what was referred to as unresolved business challenges, or he referred to it as a mystery space, and really identifying rules of thumb for those unresolved mysteries. In other words, as we discover more about them, we start to identify certain rules of thumb that we can apply, or heuristics, and ultimately take them down into this robust, repeatable, and replicable formulas for the business, and those are referred to as algorithms. And really that's the process of trying to take a business through this exercise of trying to deal with unresolved business challenges, trying to deal with building and prolonging and reducing the advantages and disadvantages space, but looking for innovative ways to assemble and mix and identify rules of thumb in an organization and specifically to try and industrialize that, to build the utility of an organization. And that's the knowledge funnel that Martin was referring to. Well, in order to do this, right, there's a business mix that we refer to. So the right mix results in what we refer to as cohesion. And a business that is cohesive is often, has a direct impact on business performance. And this is from a graph from an article written on called the Coherence Premium, which looks at the results of those businesses that are measured to have a high level of coherence across their capabilities. And I'll introduce some of these concepts as we go. And the direct impact on some of the financial results of those organizations. And really what it means, all right, is creating synergy around your market position, your products and service portfolio, and a number of distinctive strategic capabilities. Now what you see on the left there is how we, within our organization, define a business model. And it really broken down into three areas: the market model, products model, and products and services model, and an operating model. And there are a variety of classifications that we use to communicate business value through this structure to the business. That little image I'm going to refer to a lot as well, and that gives you the context of the business running within that particular environment. Now, I've got a bit of animation on this slide, so hopefully it comes through okay. Now this is another slide from Roger Martin's book on the design of business. I've customized it slightly, but really it talks about sort of two pressures that are existing in the business world today. On one side you have what's referred to as the reliability goal. In other words, that's all about reliably producing consistent and predictable outcomes. And on the other side you have an intuitive role, or a validity or space, which talks about producing outcomes that meet desired objectives. And there's this constant battle, or let's call it not a battle, a tension that exists between these two disciplines in an organization. And you see that between your innovative thinkers within an organization and those that have to try and industrialize some of that thinking. In other words, produce the models and produce the artifacts and try and realize that innovative thinking through a variety of structures and formalized structures throughout an organization. Now what we've introduced, and some of you might have seen this, is referred to as the EA headspace. So it's just a bit of thought that we've put into around what does the headspace of an architect look like. So you're welcome to download that. Just search for the EA headspace on the website. It kind of looks at the variety of skills, artifacts, and activities that would occur across those two spaces to try and address some of those goals. Now as we move through the presentation, I'm going to refer to concepts of, well, where does investment go? Where are we more likely to be able to get the wins in an organization? And this concept of analytical versus intuitive thinking, it's actually also economically supported. Let me ratify that a little better, in that in organizations, most of the investment actually goes into the analytical space because there's less risk there. It's more predictable, it's more reliable. This intuitive space, there's actually less investment going into that space. That's almost the venture capital space. So a lot of your capital planning pieces are going to go towards the left-hand side. But the challenge here is that middle piece. There's an overlap there. And the challenge for us is, well, who actually operates within that middle piece? Who's responsible for developing these rules of thumb, or actually trying to understand those rules of thumb or heuristics? And also, who's responsible for integrating? In other words, trying to bolt all of those pieces together right across those cycles, from the intuitive landscape right down to all the analytical tools and techniques that a lot of us are very familiar with. And really, that's obviously a lot of the discussion for today is, well, who is responsible for operating within that gap? Refers to that gap as design thinking, and I'm going to introduce some of those concepts as we go. But I think there's a variety of disciplines that operate within that space. And I just want to refer to this particular model again. And it was actually, we used it for one of our Tier 1 banking clients to communicate a gap that was within their organization, and it was an ownership gap. Now those concepts down the left I'm going to elaborate on a little further in what I refer to as the mandate curve. But for now it's really talking about, well, who had ownership and responsibility for the various areas of the business model. And what we're seeing is this tends to be a consistent pattern. you have ownership within the business around the market model and the products and services model, you tend to have a lot of ownership down in the application and the data and the technology space, and often sitting under the CIO or CTO space. But there's this layer in the middle, which is this business architecture world, which is often lacking ownership or sponsorship within an organization. We're seeing that change as we see more being driven now from the top down, as business itself begins to see the value of business architecture and begin to initiate programs to try and build those capabilities. But the dominant sort of feedback we get when we go into organizations is really that space is missing an ownership and a mandate to operate within the organization. And then on the right-hand side, there's also a discipline that is missing around how we string together all of the assets of the organization. I've referred to those as capabilities in a coherent fashion. If you refer to the graph I originally spoke about, building a coherent organization. Well, who's actually responsible for stringing all of those pieces together in this coherent fashion to try and prevent the sort of cascading effect of loss of synergy through the business model? And I want to elaborate a little further on that, because there's a variety of frameworks and tools that are available. Most of you online would have been certified, qualified, or have read through a number of these standards that you see on the slide. But as the lower layers, let's call it, of these standards begin to become utility, so to speak, in other words, more common space, a lot of the frameworks start to push further and further up into the business space. And they get to what I refer to as the sort of knife edge, which is the interaction with the stakeholder. And what we see is that space around the stakeholder is fairly cluttered, because each of those frameworks and each of those disciplines is actually trying to have that interaction with the stakeholder. And it creates a little bit of confusion. And I've written one or two articles around that level of confusion around, well, just for example, walking into an organization and asking them for a definition of what the business does. There's a proliferation of definitions of a capability model, a target operating model, a process model, a functional model, an anchor model, a business model. All of these terms are all attempting to achieve the same thing, but it does create a bit of confusion with that stakeholder. So in actual fact, who is responsible for that circle around that stakeholder, for actually managing that relationship? And that takes us to this slide here, and some of you are probably quite familiar with this. So what you've got in blue there is the business analyst career path, and it takes you along a journey from an entry-level business analyst up to a junior, intermediate, senior, and takes you into the space referred to as an advanced generalist business analyst. And in there, it's specialized into categories like the business architect, the strategic business analyst, a BA practice leader, and a couple of other roles. There's some hybrid roles and some specialist roles that they identify within that particular space. Now, running parallel to that, you've got the business architecture career path. Now, there's no actual defined standard for roles within the business architecture. It's still in a little bit of flux. I'm finding that the business analysis and the BA BOC definition of the roles are probably a little more mature than where the business architecture space is. But obviously within our discipline, that's how we categorize the business architecture space. So it's slightly more big picture, and I'll elaborate further on what that means later. And taking you up an analyst, business architect senior, and kind of getting up into this principal space where we start to now get to almost similar domains. So the principal business architect from our perspective is fairly similar to how BABOC, which is the business analysis body of knowledge, defines the business architecture discipline, and carrying us forward into what we refer to as the master and distinguished business architecture. Now, along the way, I think we can actually group these two, or these categories into two types, and I'll be referring to those consistently through the presentation. So those on the right there, I'll be referring to as the strategic business architect, and that includes the strategic business analyst, because there's a lot of synergies in how they define that role with how we define a strategic business architect. And there's also a lot of synergies around how a principal business architect is defined versus the generalist business architect that BOC defines. So I'll start referring to that as a principal business architect. Now I just want to take you forward into this, what we refer to as the mandate curve. It's loosely based upon Dana Bradameyer's work. but I've customized it quite heavily. And across the architecture discipline, and really that's across the business analysis discipline, across business architecture, across the enterprise architecture space, there is a mandate that those disciplines are given within a business. And that mandate refers to, in other words, the empowerment of business and what you need to achieve. And you've got a spectrum, and a lot of organizations would tend to focus on A and B, we find, in that our disciplines tend to be used for integrating, for example, let's use an IT perspective. B would be building an enterprise-wide IT system, right, or an ERP solution. Whereas moving further up the stack, you would address more of the business-oriented types of problems around stringing together business building blocks, products and services, and your marketing building blocks. We've also seen that there's a progression from phase B to C, and that's moving away from the IT space. So we're seeing the architecture discipline especially start to address more of the business-related aspects of the organization as opposed to just the IT-related. Now, I'm sorry, I'm getting some messages popping up saying that there's a disconnect. Simon, are we still good that side? Okay, I'm going to proceed. I'm not getting a response. All right, so just moving forward. All right, how does this mandate affect our different roles? So just leveraging a little. Okay, good. Thanks everyone for your feedback. Just leveraging a little from the BABOK around some of the definitions. So there's sort of three dominant areas that would occur across this mandate curve. And that's really a business improvement space on the bottom left. There's a business transition space in the middle. And there's what I'm referring to as the enterprise planning and performance space on the top right. And if we stay with that consistent messaging, you kind of get an idea of the types of scenarios that you would need to deal with across that mandate curve. So, for example, there's the design of a specific solution on the bottom left. I might have the business going through a major transformation and we need to deliver some type of solution on time and under budget. Moving further up the stack, there's scenarios such as we're losing market share due to inefficiencies, or there's losses occurring across our value chain, find out why and fix it. Kind of getting right up to the top, which is challenges like reduced cost-to-income ratio, which is a big one for the banks. There's some M&A activity occurring, help us integrate the organizations more successfully. So those are some of the scenarios that would occur across this mandate, and that implying that the business is giving the disciplines of business architecture and business analysis the mandate to help them within those spaces. It's not our role to actually do that work for them, but it's the support of the business in attempting to solve some of those particular business scenarios. Just looking a little at some of the skills, all right? Some of you might be familiar with the SOPHIA framework, and that's the skills framework for the information age, which is a good sort of general framework to map to when you're looking at measuring skills within an organization. Obviously, each of our disciplines have a very specific set of skill sets that they focus on within their own competency models. But SOPHIA is a fairly good one, and you can kind of see on the top right there, there's a gap in SOPHIA in that space, probably for obvious reasons. It's a skills framework for the information age. It's something that we are looking to support and plug into so that we can take SOPHIA to the next level in that regard. But also, down on the bottom left, you can see some of the skills that are required to operate within those various other areas as we move up that mandate curve. So then just overlaying some of the roles, what you've got is, according to the graph I showed previously, the business analyst and business architect role space, you can kind of see where those roles sit across that environment and who would be involved in the business transition space, the business improvement, and also then the enterprise planning and performance space. Now, that's very dependent upon mandate, and often we find that some of the feedback we get from both business architects and the business analysis community is, well, what's the career path? How can I progress? How can I get into some of that business planning and enterprise planning space? And what we have here is just a little career path that I've put together. And what we noticed, and having presented at some of the IIBA conferences, I've asked the group there, well, what is their career path? What is their next move? And a number of them replied, well, it's going into project management. It's going into the BA project lead and program lead space. And really that is a career option. So as you can move up the stack from the entry level to the junior BA, there's sort of two paths that you can take. One is a delivery type focus, right? And the other one is what I refer to as a planning path. In other words, down in the bottom left there is the green section as the career starts, and that's a lot of focus around delivering business outcomes. There is a thought leadership that takes place there, but that's often in the utility layer in developing standards and replicating processes and mechanisms to produce reliability. There gets a point in your career in which you, in effect, have a decision to make, in which you progress down, let's call it the management path, in which it's all about managing projects and managing the practice and managing relationships. Now, there is obviously thought leadership within that space as well. However, it's specifically management focus. And then moving up into the planning space, as you can see, it kind of moves you more into the business architect world and those two roles that I introduced previously, which is the strategic business architect and the principal business architect. And the point here is that there's often a lack of opportunity at that space within an organization to allow people to progress their careers, and they would tend to move into the management space. And sometimes that they're not then building upon the foundation of all of those good business skills that they've developed, and they kind of move more into the management role, which is all about managing people and deliverables and outcomes. So there is a career path which takes you into a more deeper space around understanding the business and in effect changing the business. A couple of reasons, I won't touch on all of these. Why is there a lack of opportunity? Well, I think a lot of it's to do with risk. And as I mentioned previously, a lot of the risk is dealt with within what's referred to as the reliability space. In other words, where things are reliable and they're predictable and they have the outcomes that we can measure, that's where people like to invest their money. It's low risk, those types of activities, and a lot of our discipline relates to building those types of activities. In other words, reliability into organizations. There's also utility driven. And business often sees the business architecture and business analysis disciplines as utility disciplines. In other words, they're helping build that reliability, and they see it almost separate of the actual business of the organization. Similarly, there's delivery-driven pieces of it. In other words, if your focus is on the delivery cycle, and that could just be a planning cycle that you're going through, but the focus at that particular time is all about building and delivering through projects and programs. Organizational driven, well, that's just your standard politics that you have to work with. And some of the structures around that space, I've actually referred to politics a little later as well. And that really is around, well, how is the organization structured to allow opportunities for us to move into those spaces and to begin to add value in those spaces. There's also, if one looks at it broadly across the spectrum, a lot of it's related to the mandate. In other words, what's the mandate that business is actually providing for us, that we can actually play in some of these broader areas. So in other words, a couple of strategies for moving up that opportunity that mandate curve. So let's starting with the planning cycle. The planning cycle and the architecture discipline especially often tends to have a disjoint between the investment planning cycle in an organization and a lot of the outcomes that the architecture team produces. So a good way that you can get closer to the business is to align better to that planning cycle and basically move slightly ahead of them to give them the types of business answers and insights that they require to be able to plan better for the organization over whatever period they're looking at, a 12 or 3-year cycle. I mean a 12-month or a 3-year cycle. Another way to open up some of those opportunities is to provide structural insight into strategic scenarios, and this is some of the stuff that I'm going to be referring to in the session at the Open Group. And really it's all about having a look at the various scenarios that occur up at the strategic planning and the business planning space, and understanding the impact of those as well as the types of effort required to achieve those scenarios. And this really helps the business make more informed investment decisions before they pull the trigger on any of those strategic scenarios. There are also ways to match capability mixes and all the underlying resources of your capabilities to see what pieces of those are going to achieve the particular outcomes of that organization. So drawing nearer to this space and being able to move up that mandate curve, definitely one of the areas is to be able to have a greater input into those strategic scenarios. One of the spaces that we found quite successful is to build what we refer to as a cross-discipline team. Sometimes that's referred to as an integrated business planning team. Some of you might be familiar with that term, or enterprise planning team. But there are a variety of disciplines that are attempting to look at an enterprise, at an organization at an enterprise level. In other words, right across all of the divisions of an organization. So, IT is one of them. You've got change management, especially in transformation programs. They're trying to look across all parts of the business to see how change is going to affect the organizational and the people aspect. You've got finance trying to look right across the organization. You've got business improvement and process improvement, which is obviously trying to look right across, and strategy, which is trying to look right across. And then often those teams or those individuals tend to operate quite separate of each other, using separate disciplines and separate techniques and tools and profiles. One of the techniques we found quite helpful was to get them all together into a room and create a team that's specifically driving out the outcomes together. Another way to move up the curve is to align yourself better to the enterprise performance model. So obviously the performance model of an organization has a feedback loop, and in mature organizations it has a stronger alignment to the objectives of the organization and how we're measuring the organization as it's moving towards achieving those objectives. And speaking of that language within an organization is definitely a key goal of yours if you want to begin to operate and move up that curve and up that career path. We often find that architects, as well as some of the business analysis community, we're all good at building good models and diagrams, but often we're not good at building those artifacts that resonate with the business people. In other words, that they can understand. And I'm going to show you a few models just now around the differences in those parts. All right, another way to move up that curve is to support the investment planning cycle. And we've done this a few times in looking across the entire investment portfolio of enterprises and looking at where there's conflict around where they're spending their capital and how that's affecting their operational expenditures, where there's loss of cohesion across the organization. So one organization comes to mind was there was one particular capability with one process, and there were 75 projects all working on that process. And that's 75 projects, and can you imagine how many meetings would need to occur just as an introduction for all of those projects to get in sync? So pulling out of that project view space and giving a business lens over that helped the organization achieve a lot of synergy. So those are some of the spaces in trying to give clarity to business leaders around how they're investing their efforts across a project portfolio, but through a business lens is a good mechanism to move up the curve as well. This is just from a bit of research done by one of our partners, Infotech, which I found to be quite interesting, and really just referring to, well, how do you choose your sponsor? And an interesting one to get good mileage, and not just because we're a consulting firm, but I found the research, which is separate of us, quite interesting, in that external consultants or individuals with recognized credibility and strength can actually add a lot to the credibility in the business case and get momentum going within the organization. And obviously there's with internal to the organization, there's the more highly placed executives and those executives that are responsible for change or in charge of transformation programs. Those are the types of individuals that you're going to draw closer to in order to extend your footprint and your visibility across your organization. Similarly, is to tie all your efforts to strategic planning materials, and that's not just a tick in a matrix to say you've met certain objectives. I think there is a strong need for the business analysis and business architecture community to understand a lot of the MBA concepts that business people are dealing with, and to be able to address them in that language. Right? And not the traditional business architecture type models, which we're all very good at producing. So we want to be able to link our traditional business architecture and business analysis artifacts to those strategic artifacts more effectively. And we're seeing just from this bit of research that the outcome of that is actually more positive within the organization and drives business engagement more effectively. And also, this is sort of the key one and some of the aspects that I referred to previously in the presentation. What you want to try and do is move through that knowledge curve as quick as you can. And really I'm seeing the business architecture of space and the strategic business architect and principle, remembering that I've grouped strategic business analysts into those spaces as well. As the space that looks to try and identify those rules of thumb from those unresolved mysteries, right? Try and extract them and understand them from the business people's minds and produce robust, repeatable formulas that work across the organization. And really, it's those individuals and those teams that are able to do that effectively and are able to produce those algorithms or those repeatable formulas effectively that are the ones that will be the more successful within an organization. Right? So understanding those heuristics that business people have in their heads, those rules of thumb, and cultivating your skills around being able to identify those is something which will help you produce those repeatable processes a lot more effectively. And there are a couple of tools and models that you can use for that. We use things like motivation models, cohesion planning, cross-functional capabilities, journey maps, learning maps, and value maps to try and help extract those rules of thumb and industrialize them, so to speak, within the organization. The challenge, of course, is that business people realize that those rules of thumb are actually their differentiator and they tend to hold on to it. So extracting that from their experience and from their minds is sometimes a challenging task. Now just to this one here, which is adapted from a business process change, it really looks at, it's a graph, quadrant graph we often refer to and we overlay processes over, which looks at strategic importance versus complexity. We've overlaid different types of complexity. This one looks at process complexity. And really what occurs in an organization, and we use this as a tactical decision-making tool. In other words, well, what should we do for certain processes across an organization? The bottom left quadrant, we would traditionally automate. Top left, we would traditionally outsource. And bottom right is where we'd look for improvement activities. And top right is sort of the complex space where there's some of those unknown business problems and when the heuristics start to take shape. And there's a journey that needs to occur from that unknown space and that complex space to right down into the sort of improvement space, ultimately into this bottom left automation, and ultimately to a point where you can outsource it. And along that journey, you have the variety of skills and roles that we've referred to. So you've got the strategic business architect, which is kind of operating in that top right quadrant, identifying those organizational heuristics, operating at that level of the major redesign of business. Kind of moving down below that, you've got the principal business architect, which is looking at structural aspects of how you start to bolt the organization together and where improvements can occur, and they're using senior business analysts to help them on that journey. This is also where things like Six Sigma and process improvement occur. This is a quadrant that looks at all of the small improvements that they can do. And this is trying to take that reliability piece of the organization and the utility parts that I keep referring to and really trying to industrialize them more effectively. And that's really disciplines like Lean and Six Sigma are really good at, is really squeezing the last bit out of those processes to get maximum effectiveness from them. And then kind of moving into the business analyst space, and that's more the junior and up to intermediate space. Not saying that senior business analysts and architects don't operate in that space, but that's just where we generally tend to use their skill sets the most. So just closing off on the opportunities and ways to help you move up the curve. Back to this little graph or this little framework that I've spoken about. There is this space at the bottom which I refer to as utility and the need to build a foundation for your organization. In other words, the business can only really produce value and differentiation if it's actually got a foundation that it can work from. It can't do those things unless it's got foundation capabilities that it can leverage. Right. And down in this space here is often where our disciplines lie, where the architecture and the business architecture and the business analysis disciplines tend to lie. are tools and techniques that enable us to create that foundation, that utility. But as your career progresses and you move up more into the strategic business analysis and strategic business architecture and principal business architect space, you're kind of looking more in the innovate, assemble and mix area, and they're identifying those business problems. Sometimes we refer to those as wicked problems, the really, really difficult ones that we have to try and solve, and using some techniques within that space to identify the heuristics so that ultimately it can become a utility within the organization. And there are a variety of tools and techniques that you can use that would help you down in that utility space. And often we use terms like frameworks, methods and tools, and that's really the space of those frameworks. They are tools that allow repeatability, allow you to build reliability into your organization, and they allow you to do it in a standardized way. Now, this is a bit of internal research that we've done. Might be a slide I might get some heat on. Happy to take the heat and improve it, but really looking at sort of three of those frameworks and bodies of knowledge. There's the BABOK, which is the business analysis body of knowledge. There's the BizBOK, which is a fairly new release, version 3, which is the business architecture body of knowledge. And there's TOGAF, which is the open group architecture framework. And the way that I've divided this is looking at sort of the different aspects of an organization. And as we look at this, you'll see that they're actually quite complementary. So at the top we've got practice development, but specifically for the business domain. And out of the sort of three tools that I'm referring to here, the BizBOK I found was fairly, was stronger than the others in specifically designing and referring to how the business architecture practice should be developed and different types of organizational models for that practice. Obviously it's a fairly new artifact or standard, and it's getting it's getting some traction and some momentum. So some cycles still to go through, but I felt that had a fairly good view of how to build a practice. The competency model for the business domain, having a look at the competency model from BABOK I found was sort of much stronger, specifically around the business disciplines here. And there's a competency model that you can use within the BABOK, and there's also a self-assessment guide that you can actually use to measure your competency. And those types of guides, to the point where they are standards and accepted and adopted, I haven't necessarily seen in the other disciplines. There's also a classification scheme, and TOGAF provides a very good classification scheme. I'll introduce you to just give you a light touch on that, because there are some of you that specifically wanted a view in this webinar as to how TOGAF can benefit the business analysis community, so I'll touch lightly on that. And that's really, well, how do I actually classify the building blocks of an organization so that I can get this cohesion and create synergy? There's also a method to execute for the enterprise. So there's two ways I've looked at that. Well, is there a method to do business or business architecture or business analysis? And is there a method to do the enterprise discipline? And that's really, you can see that TOGAF's strength is linking together multiple different domains, not just the business domain. We often refer to it as a meta framework, so it's the glue and it combines different pieces together. But it is weaker than the others in a specific business domain space on how to execute against business problems. So the business model and the business analysis and business architecture space. And that's really telling you the difference between a framework and a body of knowledge. So the two bodies of knowledge will obviously provide you much more content and techniques and methods to help you with those disciplines, whereas TOGAF bring a framework is just giving you that overall structure that you're needing to glue it all together. What TOGAF also gives you, and you can see the strength there, is a standardized technique for defining outputs. And that's this whole concept of developing views and viewpoints for particular stakeholders to address their concerns. It's a very powerful tool, and one which I don't think is used effectively within the communities and the disciplines that we all support. And that's, well, how do I actually assemble all the underlying artifacts of my discipline in a way that a stakeholder can understand to address specific concerns of that stakeholder, and the views and viewpoints technique is quite strong there. That particular technique I didn't see well documented in the other disciplines, but what they did have was fairly robust definition of outputs of work products and artifacts and what they could look like. And then also, finally, the supporting techniques. The bodies of knowledge had a lot of different types of tools that you could use to help you along that business domain. Obviously, TOGAF being a framework, it referred to those but didn't necessarily go into the detail associated to it. Now, just for those of you, and especially on the business analysis side, who there's quite a few on the call who are asking questions around TOGAF and its relevance to the business analysis community, I'm just going to do a very light touch on it, but to give you a view of the different types of structures. And really, in a very, very light touch, TOGAF is sort of three pieces that have a bucket where you can classify and store the building blocks of an organization, and a way to classify them around, well, what's a process versus an application versus a goal versus an objective, those types of things. It is a method for creating those building blocks and consuming them and assembling and mixing them. And it has a way that it will help you define different views and models for your particular stakeholders. Now, I'm not going to read these out, but just some interesting quotes. When it comes to frameworks and within our disciplines, I often find everyone has their 2 cents to add. And just a point I want to make here is that these frameworks, tools, bodies of knowledge, all of those things, they are really only relevant. They're tools in a toolbox, so to speak, right? And what makes you a strong architect or a strong analyst is leveraging those tools for specific business problems. So there's different views that people have. The one at the bottom, I had a chuckle at when I first heard that. We don't need to waste time doing business architecture. We have ETOM, which is really a reference model that we use. So there's some education that still needs to occur, specifically in the business architecture space. I kind of like this quote of Greg Fullard, which spoke about the TOGAF model, which really says, well, if you're having a game of golf and you have a toolkit to work with and you've got a bag of golf clubs, TOGAF would be a 3-wood, a 5-iron, and a glove, and it would get you. Now, I've taken some poetic license and changed that. He said it might get you. I believe it will get you onto the fairway. But there's also some other tools that you're needing to help you to sort of complete that round of golf, so to speak. And really, that's where it kind of brings it together here in this slide. I mean, your framework of TOGAF, it's a glue. And a lot of people say, oh, it's IT-centric, it's all the rest of it. Yes, it's had its origins there, but that's actually not where its value lies. Its value is broader than that, in the fact that it is a metastructure, it is a glue that will link these disciplines together. And because it is a glue, it leverages, all right, and complements the bodies of knowledge, as well as all of the other frameworks that are in this space as well. It is the one that's looking to try and create that synergy amongst all of those different frameworks. And we often see that within specifically the types of artifacts that need to be developed. So I'm going to take you through sort of the 3 building blocks of TOGAF, which is the views and models, as well as the method, and finally some of the artifacts. And I must move a little faster. So what we've got here is traditionally where things like the architecture discipline sit. And you can see on the bottom left there, that's where the business architect and business analyst tend to be positioned. But we find there's not enough granularity in that space to help you have a clearer differentiation of those roles. So we've kind of extended that model a little further to look at market products and services and organizational performance. That model is by no means complete, but looks at the types of artifacts that you would traditionally work with in those spaces. And you can see that's where the strategic business analyst is sitting, an architect is sitting at the top. Principal business architect, remember I've grouped those roles together according to the career path I showed you. And that's kind of like the senior business analyst and business architect role at the bottom. And then what you've got is you've got the traditional business analyst, which is more the junior roles. You've got an analyst business architect, and you've got the actual business architects that are playing within that process and function space, also addressing some of the information and application areas. And then you've got some of the more traditional roles, not traditional, but the broader roles, which are the solution architect as well as the enterprise architect. And you can kind of see there's quite a bit of overlap within these roles, and you can see that overlap there. That tends to be the place where there tends to be a lot of clashing or fighting for turf, so to speak, within that particular space. And really, our disciplines, especially the business analysis and business architecture discipline, have to differentiate themselves by possibly moving more to the left into more some of those other roles that I identified to you, which is sort of more up that career path. All right, just carrying on with the views and models. Just a key point here is it's not about producing the models, it's about understanding context, and it's about keeping it simple for our business people. Right? And just back to this model here, which relates to our business model and the various views and viewpoints. Depending upon the context that you're operating in, there's a variety of different views and models that you would use to be able to speak business language. And some of them aren't the traditional types of models that the business architecture and business analysis discipline has been used to. So just touching on a few of those, what we use is what's referred to as an anchor model. And I'll elaborate on a lot of this during the session at the Open Group. But really, this anchor model gives a definition of an organization's, and what an organization does. And we find it's a nice model to build a cohesive view of an organization, but it tends to be bottom-up driven. In other words, it's normally a CIO or some of the IT department that are wanting a language to communicate to business. And that particular model is quite good for that. But as from a business people's perspective, it has a very short lifespan of a value perspective. Just also from a views and viewpoints, I've introduced this concept of a capability. The definition of a capability, I'll just give you the TOGAF version, is a combination of underlying resources, people, process, and tools to drive out an outcome. Now, business people, surprisingly enough, struggle with that term. And what we've learned is that if you just change it slightly and talk to them in terms of people, process, and tools, and not actually capabilities. So you look at the resources instead of the actual grouping of those into capabilities. It tends to be much more effective when you're actually interacting with your business stakeholders. And I had to obfuscate some stuff there just for obvious reasons with our clients. Another piece where there's getting a lot of traction is the customer experience, and a lot of the traditional models of the business architecture space haven't necessarily produced many standards in that area, and we're having to invent some tools in that space to specifically deal with customer experience. What you've got is a more of approach to what we refer to as form before function, so rather understanding the experience of the customer and then looking at all of the underlying products, services, and capabilities that you can assemble to realize that experience. This is what we refer to as a motivation model, and just a sort of a hot topic, that really gets a lot of traction with the business. And coming from an architecture discipline where you'll show this to architects and they tend to scoff at it, like, oh, well, that's fairly simple. In actual fact, when you show this to business people, it's like, oh, this is just what I've been looking for, this is gold. And it's showing me the outcomes that I'm looking to achieve, what capabilities I need to focus on to achieve those, and what's in flight to try and achieve those objectives as well. So it's an extremely valuable tool, and we find business people get a lot of traction walking around with that. We provide these sort of A3 folders, and they walk around with these things in color. Now, good for the business person, but from a business architecture perspective, that's one of the artifacts you need to produce. It's obviously not adequate for the business or the architecture discipline themselves, so you've got to sort of wear two hats. And that then brings us to the method of execution. What you've got on the left there is the TOGAF ADM, the architecture development method, which is really just a structure of a method to take you through solving enterprise problems, and I won't go into too much detail on that. But really from a business architect's perspective, you've got to wear two hats, and when you're operating in this top space and you're looking at the architecture vision in the preliminary phase and those pieces of building practices, that business hat is all about trying to understand what are the right tools to solve those business problems. Within those iterations, we build the motivation model that I referred to, and this is where you begin to introduce it and get traction with the business. This is also where you begin to identify the resource mixes of some of the possible capabilities that could help you achieve the objectives, and also looking for what are the differentiation resources that sit within this space. And those are normally what you would do in a first iteration of that architecture vision phase. And the second iteration is where you now start to drill down and look at, well, what possible offerings and 4Ps and products space could I work with within that area. Key point here as well is that the business architect role has a function of journey management. Okay, just reiterating once again that the business analyst has a career path, and we're talking about this career path up to a senior business analyst, in which you've got two paths that you can travel. One, you can head into the management function. One, you can continue up into the business architecture function, which is just developing a more deeper insight into the business and the tools and techniques used within that space. So with the business architect function here, in journey management, they often have to hold the hands of the architects as they travel the journey, keeping that synergy between business stakeholders and the architecture function, keeping synergy between business stakeholders and the requirements management and business analysis functions of an organization. That's the journey that they're taking them on, constantly bringing them back to the motivation model, bringing them back to cross-functional capabilities, all of those pieces around why they're doing this and what all the efforts across the project landscape are doing to achieve it. And that's what we refer to as journey management. The other hat that the business architect would have to wear is actually the architecture hat, and that's really what occurs across phase B, C, and D. And that's really helping those individuals design solutions that are more business focused, and it tends to be downstream. This is where you take the resources, in other words, people, process, and tools and outcomes. Now you begin to cluster those into capabilities, and you produce things like capability models. You go into the detail around process models, functional models, all of those aspects. And the requirements management piece is where a lot of the business analysis community helps us a lot, because that requirements management piece is really where the architecture discipline is actually quite weak. I don't believe that the architecture space does requirements management well, and we often leverage the business analysis community a lot within that space to help us spin through that cycle and garnish and elicit the right requirements from our stakeholders. And you know, there's lots of material within BizBoc as well as BABOC around these two spaces and helping us from a requirements perspective, as well as spinning through the loop of business architecture and business information systems architecture and technology architecture. All right, just finally is then the requirements space, and really that's the business analysis space when you're looking within this context, and you can see it's quite central to an architectural exercise, and it's linked to everything across all of the domains. So it's really crucial that there are individuals in that place that have a very, very strong understanding of how to elicit and manage requirements, and as I said, the architecture discipline tends to be quite weak in that space. And therefore, that's complemented quite well by the requirements management skills that the business analysis community brings to the table. And there's lots around requirements management techniques within the BABOC and some good material on the market as well. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly touch on this. Just to finish off the classification system, the TOGAF gives you a standard classification system. So, you know, we can stop arguing about what's a process, a capability, and a function, and we can actually just get to more valuable stuff, and we can start to use standards to help us address what each of those building blocks are in an organization. Since it's a framework, it doesn't have the detail. You can have other models, all right, like the motivation model from Nick Malik, who's a Microsoft architect, specifically around the business space. And these are all freely available on the internet, by the way, that you can download, which specifically looks at business topics and how they interrelate to one another. So just finally, I just wanted to quickly close off on team roles. Just to give you a view now that I've spoken about the business architect, the business analyst, and a couple of other roles within that space. There is this balance, as I've mentioned throughout the presentation, between this intuitive piece and the analytical piece. And really, one could also say the pragmatist versus a visionary. And the discipline of business architecture is often to try and just achieve balance between those different types of personality types. It's extremely exasperating sometimes dealing with pragmatists, all right, who tend to follow the money and what works and what he sees, but just as exasperating for a pragmatist is working with a visionary who tends to follow the vision and works with what he visualizes. And that mix in the middle, that space in the middle, which Martin has referred to as design thinking, I also think is a space where business architects and senior strategic business analysts tend to operate. And often a good technique, by the way, to look for this is to do some Myers-Briggs scores, and this is just give you an idea of a successful team in doing transformation at the business level. So in other words, what does that team look like? What type of mix of individuals should I have in that team to be able to transform the business and take them on the journey? And I've just copied and pasted a few of the strengths specifically that sit within those spaces. So Myers-Briggs tends to be the more common one. We use a slightly different one, but we also use the Myers-Briggs ones as a light touch into our team structure. So just finally, before we head into some questions, don't forget the Open Group Conference. That's April the 15th to the 17th in Sydney, first time in Australia, and I'll hopefully be looking forward to seeing some of you there and fielding some of your questions. So, right, that's all I have to say, so thank you for that. Over to questions, Simon.
That's great, Craig. Many thanks for that. With over 450 people today, we've had a very interesting exchange of discussions on the text, Craig. So I think you've really tapped into a really strong theme of interest there. Just before we move through some of the questions, Craig, I've had a lot of inquiries about the availability of your slide deck. Will you be making the slides available?
I think the recording will be available. We'll obfuscate some stuff and issue a PDF to the group. So yes, they'll be able to access most of the slides.
That's fantastic. So Craig, we've got a few minutes, so let's just work through a couple of the questions. Got a question here asking about consolidation between TOGAF and BABOK. He's saying, it seems that business analysts, according to BABOK, has the same tasks and responsibilities as a business architect. But in TOGAF specification preliminary phase, that's phase A and B, the role as a business architect is far different from what's said in BABOK. So he's asking, my question is it time to consolidate the two standards, TOGAF and BABOK, regarding business analyst and business architecture as activities and roles?
Yeah, I think that's very insightful. Definitely, and it's sort of a key message for an article I've just recently written, and really there needs to be consolidation within this space because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, as we get closer and closer to the stakeholder is the one who lands up being confused. So yeah, very much so. I think that there is definite need for consolidation within that space. And there are activities on both of those forums in which a lot of those discussions do occur. I mean, the Open Group and the IIBA do have interactions together. But yeah, when it comes to published standards, definitely a need for us to create a consistent message for our stakeholders there.
Thanks, Craig. A question here from John Heaton. He's saying, do you have any words of wisdom on how to start a business analyst architect group within an organisation?
Yeah, I think if I could just interpret that question, in other words, we see the value of business architecture. How do we actually get this combined group? How do we get this group actually up and running in an organization? And one of the more successful implementations of those was for a sort of parastatal government client that we work with, and that's really around in effect created a temporary project, let's call it a transformation project for now, in which a number of business individuals were sourced from the business divisions and created this project team, which was complemented with business analysts and business architects and IT architects within that space to solve a specific transformation problem. During that task, that team's responsibility was to basically build out a practice of doing this as well, although slightly covertly, I might add. So although to the rest of the business it was responsible for delivering actual outcomes from the transformation, on the side it was actually building up a practice, and ultimately once the value had been seen from delivering the business outcomes to the transformation exercise, the practice was already developed and up and running, and basically switched over to a permanent function. And that was really a bit of a covert activity to try and get that off the ground. I have referred in my presentation to different techniques to help you get those things off the ground, but often these things are organizational, and it's sometimes we refer to ways, covert ways and overt ways to begin to introduce these types of practices into an organization.
Thanks, Craig. Running out of time, we've got a couple of questions about how Archimate fits into all this. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so Archimate is a notation standard. It also has a classification scheme. So I introduced the TOGAF classification scheme, and Archimate has one. And it's really, as UML is a notation scheme, as BPMN is a notation scheme, so Archimate is a notation scheme, but specifically to help you document and model architectural artifacts. And I have a sort of view on where Archimate could go. So, for example, as a WSDL, which is a web service description language, is to a web service. In other words, it describes the web service so that you can plug them together like two Lego blocks and they'll work. So Archimate is to a building block, an architectural building block. In other words, if we model our building blocks in an organization in a standard architectural representation, it becomes much easier to plug those building blocks together. And that's really what Archimate's playing to within that particular space. So it in itself is complementary and is a tool that you can use right across the spectrums of business data application technology. The classification scheme there is just slightly different and would need to be merged with whatever sort of scheme you're using underlying in your business.
That's great, Craig. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, so I think this would be a good time to end today's presentation. If we haven't managed to ask your questions, there have been quite a few, please feel free to send them through and I'll make sure they get sent through to Craig, and I'm sure that Craig will be more than happy to deal with your questions offline. Craig, I'd like to thank you today for your time. That's been a very informative presentation, and I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. So Craig, if you're happy, I'll end the presentation.
Yes, thank you everyone. Thanks Simon for the time.
Great, thank you.